Why do you think the Republicans have been historically unable to make the connection with minority voters? Is it the policy on immigration, do you think, or the notion that they're a status quo party?
Well, I think, first of all, that historically they were the status quo party. And I think that immigrants are basically told, you're supposed to be a liberal Democrat. What's happened is, as liberal Democrat has turned into radical Democrat, they've said, that's not me. And I think that you're seeing, this has been a gradual, steady drift in the right direction. And I think you're seeing, I think Bush actually got up to 44% of the Latino vote in 2004. Then we backslid for a little while, and now we're back again. And I suspect that this year and in 2024, we'll actually carry a majority of Latinos. And from the standpoint of the Democrats, that's the beginning of the end. If they lose working class whites and they lose Latinos, they can't be competitive.
It's so interesting to see, too, isn't it, that as the Democrats beat the oppression drum and claim to be standing up for the victimized in this remarkably moral manner, that they're in fact alienating exactly the people that they claim to support. First of all, the working class, because they did a cataclysmic job of alienating the working class, especially in the Clinton campaign. It was something stunning to watch. And now exactly the same thing is happening on the minority front. And so the very people whose tender mercies are supposed to be being targeted by this victimization narrative are the people who, as soon as they understand it, do everything they possibly can to reject it.
But I think that's happening in part because among the graduate school educated elites, you're really dealing with a secular religion rather than a political movement. And therefore you have all of the fervor and intensity and blindness of a religious movement. So they have to assume that these other people are just wrong. They can't hear them because the messages being sent to them by minorities and by working class whites are messages which are heresy given their secular religion. And I think that's at the heart of this. That's why you kind of somebody like Bill Gates say recently that it's really good we have these really high prices for fossil fuels, because that's really going to lead people to understand how important greenism is. Well, if you're a family that's going to have an electric blackout this winter, or you're somebody who can't afford to buy heating oil, and you somehow think a billionaire telling you how good it is for you to be in pain is probably pretty stupid.
Yeah, well, the Deputy Prime Minister in Canada, Chrystia Freeland, said exactly the same thing about high gas prices in Canada at the pump. It's like it's good for people to pay a little bit more when they're filling up their car because it helps them understand just how serious the climate crisis is. Now, you describe this as a secular religious movement on the left. What do you think the elements of that secular religious movement are? And I'm going to put another codicil on that question too. So there's famous gospel dictum, obviously, that you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And one question that arises as a consequence of that is what happens if you don't render unto God what is God's? And it looks to me like what happens is that the sacred collapses into the political, such that the political becomes sacred for those who are a-religious. It's inevitable. And I've been thinking about this from a psychological perspective, So if you imagine that we have a hierarchy of conception, such that some things we perceive and conceive of are shallow and other things are deep, and the deep things are those upon which many ideas are dependent. So constitutional axioms, for example, in that manner would be deep. And the self-evident presuppositions upon which the constitutional axioms are predicated would even be deeper. The deeper down you go, the more it becomes religious in some real sense. And there's no getting away from depth in that manner, because without that hierarchy of depth, you have a kind of incoherence at best. And so there's no getting away from the religious if you think about it technically in that manner. And then if you don't have a religious story or a religious substrate, then it seems to me that what happens is the political starts to become the substitute for that depth. And then we get into a situation where we can't even talk about political things anymore because it becomes taboo. And that seems to be part of this secularized religion that's part of what? It's part of woke activism. It's part of the insistence that human beings are a cancer on the planet and destroying it. It's part of this insane insistence on climate remediation before everything else, including providing food and shelter and energy to the poor. And that seems to be what's being rejected en masse by the working class, and also now increasingly by minority voters.
Well, I mean, Dennis Prager has a very nice formula. He says, big God, small government, big government, small God. And in a way, when I described...
Oh, yes, I haven't heard him say that.
But when I described big government socialism in my most recent book, I was trying to get at this notion. What you have in some ways is the ferocity of the Reformation. You have the kind of attitude which was captured in A Man for All Seasons, where the son-in-law is asked, would you knock down a law to get at the devil? And he says, well, of course. And he said, and then would you knock down the next law? And then when you finally end up having driven the devil all the way to Wales and he turns, what is going to stand between you and him now that you've knocked down all the laws? And I think what you have on the left is the ferocity of the Reformation, the ferocity of the French Revolution at its peak. Callista and I visited the cemetery in Paris, where the Marquis de Lafayette is buried. And it was a cemetery. He personally was not harmed by the revolution, but his wife's relatives were all aristocrats, and they were all guillotined. And they were buried in that cemetery, and so she asked that he and she be buried there. It's also the cemetery in which the Catholic nuns were buried who had gone singing to the guillotine because they refused to give up Christ, and they were therefore had to be guillotined. It's the ferocity of Leninism, which annihilated much of the social structure of Tsarist Russia. It's the ferocity of Maoism, which annihilated much of the structure, the Confucian structure of China. Well, that ferocity is what leads people to say that we ought to have transgenderism for 3-year-olds. We ought to make sure that we have black dormitories in the name of anti-racism, that we ought to make sure that white males don't get hired for anything because they're clearly the source of all of our problems, that we ought to condemn Christopher Columbus for having discovered the New World because somehow he eliminated the purity of Native Americans, which requires a stunningly ahistorical understanding of Native Americans. All of this is a modern religion, and I think has to be dealt with. That's why I'm working on this paper on the Democratic Party's two wings as weird and insane. The weird wing is sort of in touch with reality, but weird. The insane wing is totally out of touch with the real world and is drifting off into a never land in which it is quite prepared to kill people like you and me if that's the cost of getting to nirvana.